Right now, an Earth-like planet orbits the star closest to our Sun. Proxima b sits just 4.24 light-years away. Scientists have confirmed it exists in the habitable zone, where liquid water could flow. Every space agency on Earth dreams of sending humans there. We have designed nuclear engines, antimatter drives, and light sails that could theoretically make the journey. Yet no human will ever set foot on that world. The reason has nothing to do with distance, propulsion, or physics. The real barrier is something far more terrifying. Something we cannot engineer our way around. Something buried in the very nature of human civilization itself. The answer will change how you think about humanity's future among the stars. If you want to understand why our cosmic dreams face an impossible barrier, hit that like button and subscribe. This journey will take us through the mathematics of interstellar travel, the history of human civilizations, and the uncomfortable truth that no technology can fix. Now get yourself comfortable. Let's begin. The number seems almost manageable at first. 4.24 light-years, compared to the billions of light-years spanning the observable universe. Proxima b practically sits in our cosmic backyard. The nearest star system to our own contains a planet that might harbour liquid water, might support life, might offer humanity a second home among the stars. Every documentary about interstellar travel begins with this tantalizing proximity. Every space enthusiast memorizes the distance, like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. But this number hides a deception so profound that most people never grasp its true meaning. The deception is not about physics. The deception is not about engineering. The deception concerns something far more fundamental to human existence. Something we cannot build our way around no matter how advanced our rockets become. Light travels at 186,000 miles per second. Nothing in the universe moves faster. This cosmic speed limit represents the absolute maximum velocity that information, matter, or energy can achieve in our reality. A beam of light leaving Earth right now would reach Proxima b in approximately 4 years and 3 months. That journey time sounds almost reasonable to human ears, accustomed to planning decades ahead. We build cathedrals that take centuries to complete. We plant trees whose shade we will never enjoy. We establish institutions that we hope will outlast our grandchildren. Surely we can engineer a vessel capable of crossing 4 light-years within a human lifetime. Surely the species that split the atom and walked on the moon can bridge the gap to another star. The mathematics of propulsion shatter this illusion completely. The fastest object humanity has ever built is the Parker Solar Probe, designed to study our Sun at close range. At its peak velocity during solar approaches, this spacecraft reaches approximately 430,000 miles per hour. Speed exceeds anything achieved by previous human engineering. The probe plunges toward the Sun and uses gravitational acceleration to achieve velocities that would circle Earth in under 4 minutes. If we could somehow maintain this velocity across interstellar distances, the journey to Proxima b would require roughly 6,600 years. Consider what that number means in human terms. 6,600 years ago, humans had not yet invented writing. Agriculture was a recent innovation spreading slowly across scattered human populations. Every civilization that has ever existed, every empire that has risen and fallen, every transformation of human society from hunter-gatherers to digital networks has occurred within this time span. The entire recorded history of our species would unfold during transit. Generations would be born, live their entire lives, and die aboard a vessel that had not yet travelled 1/10 of the distance to its destination. The passengers who finally arrived at Proxima b would share no language, no culture, no institutional memory with the civilization that launched them. They would be as alien to their ancestors as we are to the humans who first domesticated wheat. Current rocket technology cannot approach even these inadequate speeds for sustained interstellar journeys. Chemical rockets expend their fuel within minutes of launch. The tremendous energies released by burning hydrogen and oxygen produce impressive thrust but cannot sustain acceleration across the years required to reach meaningful interstellar velocities. Ion drives produce efficient thrust for extended periods but generate only microscopic accelerations. A spacecraft using ion propulsion would require tens of thousands of years to reach Proxima b. Our actual technological capability for sustained interstellar travel sits far below even the Parker Solar Probe benchmark. We have not developed power sources capable of sustaining such engines for decades or centuries. The gap between current capability and interstellar requirement spans orders of magnitude that dwarf any technological leap in human history, but theoretical physics offers more promising numbers. Nuclear pulse propulsion, conceived during the 1950s Project Orion studies, could theoretically accelerate a spacecraft to perhaps 3 to 5% of light speed. The concept involves detonating nuclear explosives behind a massive pusher plate, using the momentum of expanding plasma to accelerate a spacecraft far beyond chemical rocket capabilities. At 5% of light speed, the journey to Proxima b would require approximately 85 years. This remains beyond a single human lifespan, but falls within the range of multi-generational planning. A child born at launch might see the destination before death. A crew of young adults might survive to witness arrival in extreme old age. More speculative technologies push these numbers further. Antimatter propulsion, which would annihilate matter and antimatter to release energy with perfect efficiency, might achieve 10% of light speed. This would reduce transit to roughly 42 years. A crew departing in their 20s could arrive in their 60s, elderly but still capable of establishing initial colonial infrastructure. Breakthrough propulsion concepts push even further into theoretical territory. Laser-driven light sails could potentially reach 20% of light speed by using enormous ground-based laser arrays to accelerate gossamer-thin spacecraft across interstellar distances. At such velocities, the journey time drops to approximately 21 years. These numbers transform the conversation entirely. 21 years falls within a single human lifetime. A crew departing Earth in their 20s could arrive at Proxima b in their 40s, still young enough to establish a colony, still connected to their memories of Earth, still carrying the culture and knowledge of their civilization of origin. Here is where the deception reveals itself. Every optimistic propulsion estimate assumes something that has never existed in human history. These calculations assume that humanity will develop breakthrough propulsion technology, construct interstellar vessels requiring global industrial coordination, train specialized crews through multi-generational space programs, and maintain the political and economic systems necessary to support such endeavors across the decades required for development and voyage completion. The fastest theoretical propulsion still requires decades of travel time. The development of such propulsion systems would require additional decades of research, testing, and construction. Mission planning, crew training, and political coordination add more decades. Before a single human being could depart for Proxima b, human civilization would need to maintain coherent technological, political, and economic systems for most of a century. This requirement has never been met in human history. Not once. Not anywhere. Not under any political system or cultural framework humanity has ever devised. The Roman Empire lasted approximately 500 years in the West and 1500 in the East. But its technological, political, and cultural character transformed beyond recognition multiple times during that span. The Rome of Augustus bore little resemblance to the Rome of Constantine. Augustus ruled a pagan empire expanding through military conquest. Constantine ruled a Christian empire, consolidating through administrative reform. Neither would recognize the Byzantine court of Justinian as their successor civilization. The language had evolved, the religion had transformed, the economic systems had restructured, The military had reorganized around entirely different principles. What appeared as continuity from outside revealed constant transformation from within. Historians speak of Roman civilization as a continuous entity, but this continuity is a retrospective construction. Romans living through the transformations experienced disruption, not continuity. Each generation confronted a world their parents would not have recognized. The Chinese dynastic system maintained superficial continuity for over 2,000 years, but each dynasty represented radical breaks in governance, technology, and cultural values. The Tang dynasty Chinese would struggle to comprehend the Ming. Different writing conventions had emerged, different philosophical frameworks dominated scholarship, different technologies shaped daily life, different administrative systems organized society. Neither Tang nor Ming Chinese would recognize Qing governance as their own civilization. The Qing represented Manchu conquest, foreign occupation, cultural imposition from outside the traditional Chinese sphere. What historians call continuous Chinese civilization actually describes a series of distinct societies occupying the same geographic region. They shared ancestry. They shared some cultural elements. They did not share the institutional, technological, or political coherence that interstellar missions would require. Modern nations offer even less reassurance. The United States has maintained constitutional government for approximately 250 years, but the nation of 1789 shares little practical similarity with contemporary America. The founders lived in an agricultural society of 3 million people. They travelled by horse and communicated by letter. They governed through direct personal relationships among a small elite. They could not have imagined automobiles, telecommunications, nuclear weapons, or digital networks. Technologies, economic systems, social values, and political coalitions have transformed beyond recognition. The documents remain. The institutions bearing the same names persist. But the substance of American civilization has undergone complete metamorphosis multiple times. The founders would not understand the society their documents now govern. They would not recognize its technology, its demographics, its international position, or its internal divisions. The Soviet Union, built explicitly to last forever, to represent the inevitable end point of historical development, collapsed after 74 years. An entire civilization constructed around the premise of permanent stability dissolved within a single human lifetime. The grandchildren of revolutionaries who believed they were building eternity watched the entire system disintegrate before their eyes. The British Empire, on which the sun famously never set, dismantled within decades of its apparent peak. In 1920, British power spanned every continent. A generation later, that empire existed only in history books and ceremonial vestiges. The European colonial systems that seemed to represent permanent global order dissolved within a single generation after 1945. No human civilization has ever maintained the coherent technological, political, and economic continuity that interstellar travel demands for the timescales interstellar travel requires. This is not pessimism. This is observation. The historical record speaks with absolute clarity on this point. This brings us back to the real limitation, confronting humanity's interstellar dreams. The problem is not propulsion. Engineers can sketch nuclear pulse drives and antimatter engines and laser sails with reasonable confidence that physics permits their function. The equations balance. The energy requirements, while enormous, do not violate thermodynamic laws. Theoretical propulsion systems could work if built according to their designs. The problem is not distance. 4.24 light-years represents a finite, comprehensible span that light itself crosses in just over 4 years. Proxima b is close by cosmic standards. It orbits the nearest star to our Sun. If interstellar travel is possible anywhere, it should be possible here. The problem is not resources. Earth contains sufficient materials to construct interstellar vessels. and the solar system offers effectively unlimited raw materials for civilizations capable of space-based manufacturing. Asteroid mining could provide metals. Lunar facilities could enable construction in microgravity. The resources exist if the civilization capable of utilizing them persists long enough to do so. The problem is time. The problem is what happens to human civilizations across the decades and centuries that even optimistic interstellar scenarios require. The problem is civilization continuity collapse. Proxima b was confirmed to exist in 2016. Astronomers at the European Southern Observatory detected the planet through careful observation of its host star's wobble, measuring gravitational effects with instruments sensitive enough to detect motion smaller than walking speed. The discovery sparked immediate speculation about habitability, colonization, and humanity's expansion beyond the solar system. Scientists debated whether Proxima b might retain an atmosphere despite its host star's violent flare activity. They calculated potential surface temperatures. They speculated about liquid water. They dreamed about second Earths orbiting the star next door. But consider what has happened to human civilization in just the 8 years since that discovery. Political systems have fractured across democracies worldwide. Economic paradigms have shifted through pandemic disruption. Technological landscapes have transformed through artificial intelligence development. International cooperation on scientific projects has fluctuated. With diplomatic tensions, space programs have changed priorities multiple times based on shifting political winds. 8 years, less than a decade. Already the institutional landscape that might support interstellar efforts has transformed dramatically. The world of 2016 shares a recent past with the world of today. Yet the two worlds operate according to different assumptions, different priorities, different political alignments. Now extend this transformation across the 85 years required for a voyage at 5% of light speed. Extend it across the additional decades of mission support following departure. No human institution has ever demonstrated the stability this timeline demands. No government has maintained consistent policy priorities for 85 years. No corporation has preserved unchanged corporate culture for 85 years. No scientific institution has maintained unified research direction for 85 years. The architects of interstellar missions face an engineering problem they cannot solve through better propulsion, stronger materials, or more efficient life support. They face the fundamental instability of human civilization itself. They face a constraint that no technology can address, because the constraint is not technological. Launch a mission to Proxima b, and the civilization that launched it will not exist when the mission arrives. The political systems will have transformed. The economic structures will have evolved. The cultural values will have drifted. The language will have changed. The very meaning of the mission will have been reinterpreted through lenses the original planners could not anticipate. This is not speculation about what might happen under unfavorable circumstances. This is observation of what always happens to human civilizations across timescales measured in decades and centuries. The historical record admits no exceptions. Every civilization that appeared stable eventually transformed beyond recognition. Every institution that seemed eternal eventually dissolved or evolved into something its founders would not recognize. Consider the implications for a specific interstellar scenario. A spacecraft departs Earth in 2050, carrying colonists toward Proxima b. The vessel uses advanced nuclear pulse propulsion capable of 5% light speed. Transit time is 85 years. Arrival is projected for 2135. The colonists who arrive in 2135 will attempt to contact Earth. They will send radio signals traveling at light speed. Those signals will reach Earth in 2139, 89 years after departure. The civilization that receives those signals will be as different from the launch civilization as contemporary society differs from the world of 1950. In 1950, commercial aviation was young. Television was a novelty. Computers filled entire rooms and possessed less processing power than a modern calculator. The internet did not exist. Smartphones were unimaginable. Genetic engineering was science fiction. The political map of the world looked entirely different. Colonial empires still controlled much of Africa and Asia. The civilization that launched an interstellar mission in 1950 would share nothing with the civilization receiving signals from that mission today, except geographic location and species membership. The language would have evolved. The technology would have transformed. The political systems would have restructured. The economic frameworks would have revolutionized. The cultural values would have shifted beyond recognition. The mathematics of interstellar travel crash against the mathematics of civilizational continuity. Even optimistic propulsion scenarios require timescales that exceed human civilization's demonstrated coherence limits. The faster the propulsion, the shorter the journey, but no credible propulsion technology reduces journey times below the transformation timescales of human societies. Current propulsion technology places Proxima b thousands of years away. Nuclear pulse propulsion places it approximately 85 years away. Antimatter drives might reduce this to 42 years. Light sail concepts might achieve 21 years. Each improvement represents enormous engineering challenges that would themselves require decades of civilizational coherence to accomplish. 21 years remains longer than any interstellar mission development program has ever lasted. The Apollo program, humanity's most ambitious space achievement, required approximately 11 years from President Kennedy's declaration to the final moon landing. It consumed roughly 4% of federal budget at its peak. It demanded sustained political will through multiple administrations, and it targeted a destination 3 light seconds away, not 4 light years. 21 years exceeds the duration of Apollo by a factor of nearly 2. It surpasses the entire Space Shuttle program, which ran from 1981 to 2011. It dwarfs the attention span of any political system for any project not driven by immediate crisis. And 21 years represents only the journey. Time for propulsion technology that does not yet exist and might require additional decades to develop. The light sail concepts that promise 21-year transit times remain theoretical. Building the laser arrays required to accelerate such sails would demand global coordination, enormous energy infrastructure, and decades of construction. The development program alone might exceed 21 years. The deception in that 4.24 light-year figure now stands fully exposed. The distance is not the barrier. The distance is merely the frame within which the true barrier operates. Human civilization cannot remain coherent long enough to develop interstellar propulsion, launch interstellar missions, and maintain support for multi-decade voyages. The true barrier sits not in the void between stars, but in the nature of human social organization itself. Engineers designing interstellar missions specify propulsion systems, life support requirements, radiation shielding, and communication arrays. They calculate delta-V budgets and fuel consumption curves. They model trajectory optimizations and gravity assists. They design redundant systems and failure recovery protocols. Every technical specification assumes that civilization will remain stable enough to build what they design. Every mission plan assumes that political systems will maintain funding commitments across decades. Every crew training program assumes that institutions will preserve knowledge and purpose across generations of personnel turnover. These assumptions contradict everything historical observation reveals about human civilization. They project stability onto systems that have never demonstrated stability at required timescales. They treat as engineering parameters what are actually civilizational variables subject to transformation on timescales shorter than interstellar mission requirements. The most sophisticated propulsion design becomes irrelevant if the civilization required to build it transforms into something that no longer values or supports such projects. The most detailed mission plan becomes worthless if the institutions responsible for execution dissolve, reform, or redirect before implementation. Political priorities shift with electoral cycles. Economic resources reallocate with market fluctuations. Cultural values evolve with generational turnover. Scientific priorities redirect with paradigm shifts. Every factor required for interstellar mission success varies on timescales shorter than interstellar missions require. Proxima b will remain in the habitable zone of its star for billions of years. The planet's orbit is stable. Its host star will continue burning for trillions of years. Time does not threaten the destination. Time threatens only the travelers and the civilizations that might send them. This realization transforms how we must think about interstellar travel. The challenge is not primarily technological. The challenge is civilizational. Before humanity can reach the nearest potentially habitable exoplanet, we must solve a problem no human society has ever solved. We must create civilizational structures capable of maintaining coherent purpose, technological capability, and institutional function across timescales measured in centuries. Every proposed technical solution to interstellar travel presupposes this civilizational solution. Every propulsion concept, every mission architecture, every colonization plan assumes that human civilization will remain stable enough to execute their designs. None of them explain how this stability will be achieved. None of them acknowledge that such stability has never been demonstrated in human history. None of them address the fundamental constraint that makes all their calculations irrelevant. The journey to Proxima b begins not with rocket engines but with this uncomfortable truth. We are a species that dreams across light years while struggling to maintain coherent institutions across decades. We sketch starships while our civilizations transform around us. We calculate trajectories to other worlds while the societies that might launch those missions evolve, fragment, and reconstitute in forms their predecessors could not anticipate. 4.24 light years. 21 years at best case theoretical propulsion. Decades of development time preceding any launch. No human civilization has ever maintained coherent technological purpose across such time spans. This brings us back to the real limitation that every interstellar proposal must confront. Not the distance, not the physics, not the engineering. The limitation is civilization, continuity, collapse. The inability of human societies to maintain the coherent structure that interstellar travel demands across the timescales interstellar travel requires. We can design the engines. We can calculate the trajectories. We can specify the life support systems, but we cannot guarantee that the civilization capable of building these things will persist long enough to build them. We cannot ensure that the institutions responsible for launch will survive to support the mission. We cannot promise that the values motivating departure will retain meaning during transit. The stars will wait. They have waited for billions of years. They will wait billions more. But human civilizations do not wait. They transform, fragment, dissolve, and reconstitute in patterns that no engineering can prevent. The distance to Proxima b is 4.24 light-years. The distance to civilizational stability, capable of bridging that gap, has never been measured because no human society has ever traveled it. The most common solution proposed for interstellar travel appears elegant in its simplicity. If journey times exceed individual human lifespans, construct vessels large enough to sustain populations across multiple generations. Launch not crews but colonies. Establish self-sustaining ecosystems within hull plating. Let travelers be born, live their lives, and die during transit, with their descendants completing what ancestors began. Generation ships populate science fiction with compelling regularity. They describe societies that have adapted to life between stars, maintaining purpose across centuries of travel through the void. The concept seems to sidestep the propulsion limitations that constrain faster approaches. If we cannot make the journey fast, we make the journey sustainable. If individual humans cannot survive transit times measured in centuries, We ensure that human populations persist where individual humans cannot. The mathematics appear straightforward. Calculate the minimum viable population for genetic diversity. Design closed-loop life support systems capable of operating for centuries. Build redundancy into critical systems. Launch and wait. This solution contains a paradox that becomes apparent only when examined through the lens of civilizational continuity. Generation ships do not transport civilization across interstellar distances. Generation ships create isolated conditions that guarantee civilizational transformation at rates far exceeding anything observed in terrestrial human history. The paradox emerges from a fundamental misunderstanding about what generation ships would actually transport. Engineers designing these vessels focus on physical requirements: hull integrity, radiation shielding, atmospheric recycling, food production, waste processing. These specifications can be calculated, tested, and verified. Physical systems can be designed for multi-century operation, but generation ships must transport something far more fragile than atmospheric processors or hydroponic farms. They must transport functioning human societies capable of operating complex technology, maintaining social order, and preserving mission purpose across timescales that have destroyed every civilization in human history. This social cargo cannot be specified in engineering documents. It cannot be tested before launch. It cannot be verified through simulation, and it will fail. Not might fail, will fail. The mechanisms of failure are as predictable as orbital mechanics, operating through processes that human populations have never successfully resisted across the timescales generation ships require. Consider language drift. Linguists have documented the rate at which isolated human populations develop distinct dialects, vocabularies, and eventually mutually unintelligible languages. The process operates with remarkable consistency across cultures and geographic separations, following patterns that appear to be intrinsic to how human language evolves in isolated communities. The Great Vowel Shift transformed English pronunciation between roughly 1400 and 1700, making Middle English texts nearly incomprehensible to modern readers without specialized training. 3 centuries. The language of Chaucer became foreign to the language of Shakespeare, became foreign to modern English speakers. Each transition occurred within populations that maintained continuous contact with broader English-speaking communities. Approximately 300 years of isolation produces language divergence sufficient to impede casual communication between separated populations. Speakers must slow down, repeat themselves, request clarification. Technical vocabulary diverges first, as specialized terms lose their original contexts and acquire new meanings through local usage. 500 years of isolation produces distinct languages, requiring formal study for mutual comprehension. 1,000 years produces languages as different as English and German, or Spanish and Romanian, clearly related through common ancestry, but requiring translation for any meaningful exchange. A generation ship traveling to Proxima b at 5% of light speed would maintain complete isolation from Earth for 85 years in transit, plus whatever communication delays follow arrival. Light speed messages would require over 4 years to travel each direction. Practical communication would be impossible. The isolation would be absolute in ways that no terrestrial population has ever experienced. But this initial isolation merely begins the divergence process. The ship's population would experience no new linguistic input from external sources. No new words would arrive from Earth. No linguistic innovations from other communities would enter shipboard vocabulary. Every linguistic evolution would compound internally without the stabilizing influence of broader language communities. Under these conditions, language drift accelerates dramatically beyond terrestrial baselines. Studies of isolated communities on Earth demonstrate that novel vocabulary emerges rapidly in closed populations. New words arise to describe unique local conditions. Old words shift meaning to address new contexts. Technical terminology proves particularly vulnerable to semantic drift as original contexts fade from living memory. The word computer once meant a person who performed mathematical calculations. The word cell once referred only to small rooms. The word web once described only spider constructions. Each semantic shift occurred within connected populations where broader usage slowed the drift. In isolated populations, such shifts proceed without restraint. Within 3 generations, the language spoken aboard a generation ship would diverge measurably from the language of mission planners on Earth. Pronunciation would shift as children learned from parents who learned from grandparents, each transmission introducing small variations that compound over time. Grammar would simplify in some areas and complexify in others, based on local usage patterns. Vocabulary would specialize around shipboard concerns, while terms for terrestrial concepts faded from active use. Within 10 generations, mutual comprehension between shipboard language and Earth language would require conscious effort. Speakers from each population would recognize common ancestry in their tongues, but would need to speak slowly, choose words carefully, and frequently request clarification. Technical documents from Earth would require interpretation by linguistic specialists. Within 20 generations, languages would share ancestry but require formal translation. A message from Earth written in contemporary English would be as foreign to shipboard readers as Old English texts are to modern English speakers. The words would appear vaguely familiar. The meaning would be inaccessible without scholarly intervention. A vessel launched with comprehensive documentation in a standardized language would find that documentation increasingly opaque to later generations. Technical manuals written for launch-era engineers would become historical artifacts requiring specialist interpretation. Mission parameters defined in launch-era language would require translation across not just vocabulary but conceptual framework. The assumptions embedded in launch-era documentation would become invisible to readers who had never shared those assumptions. Navigation systems designed with English interfaces would become as mysterious as hieroglyphics to descendants who no longer spoke recognizable English. Emergency procedures written for launch-era comprehension would fail when emergencies actually occurred centuries later. The linguistic foundation upon which all technical knowledge rested would erode beneath the weight of accumulated drift. But language drift represents only one dimension of the transformation generation ships would experience. Cultural evolution proceeds even faster than linguistic change in isolated populations. Anthropological studies of separated human communities reveal that cultural values, social structures, and belief systems transform within 3 to 5 generations of isolation. The mechanisms operate through the same transmission processes that affect language, but compound more rapidly because cultural knowledge depends more heavily on contextual understanding. Founding values fade as the generations that held them firsthand die. The crew members who departed Earth would carry direct memories of terrestrial life. They would remember sunsets and oceans and forests. They would recall the faces of people they left behind. They would understand viscerally why the mission mattered, what Earth represented, what reaching another star would mean for humanity. Their children would receive Earth as stories. They would hear descriptions of blue skies and green forests from parents who had seen such things. They would learn about terrestrial life through transmitted narrative rather than direct experience. The emotional weight of Earth would diminish, even as factual knowledge persisted. Their grandchildren would receive Earth as mythology. The stories would become more abstract, filtered through 2 generations of retelling. Details would blur. Emotional connections would attenuate. Earth would become a concept rather than a memory, an origin story rather than a lived reality. Subsequent generations would inherit increasingly abstract conceptions of origin and purpose, filtered through accumulated interpretation and adaptation to shipboard conditions. The concrete reality of departure would become legendary. The specific reasons for the mission would generalize into traditional narratives, whose connection to original circumstances would grow increasingly tenuous. The mission itself would undergo reinterpretation across generations. Original objectives defined by mission planners on Earth would be received by later generations through lenses shaped entirely by shipboard experience. What did colonization mean to people who had never seen a planet? What did humanity's future mean to people who had never met another human outside their vessel? What did home mean to people born in transit with no memory of anything beyond metal walls? Priorities would shift as circumstances changed and original context faded. Later generations would emphasize aspects of the mission that served their immediate concerns, while de-emphasizing elements that seemed irrelevant to shipboard life. The mission that departed Earth would not be the mission that arrived at Proxima b, regardless of whether the ship itself remained physically intact. Historical examples illuminate this process with uncomfortable clarity. The Polynesian peoples who settled the Pacific Islands departed from common ancestral populations in Southeast Asia. Archaeological and genetic evidence traces their migration across thousands of miles of open ocean, island hopping through Melanesia, and into the vast Pacific. They carried common cultural elements, navigation techniques, agricultural practices, religious concepts, social structures. Within a few thousand years of separation, they developed distinct languages, religions, social structures, and technological traditions. Hawaiian culture shared common ancestry with Maori culture, but the two would have been mutually incomprehensible by the time of European contact. Tahitian practices differed dramatically from Tongan practices. Despite geographic proximity, islands separated by only a few hundred miles of ocean-developed cultures that would have been mutually unintelligible to their common ancestors. The Polynesian example involved populations that occasionally maintained contact through voyaging. Trade networks linked some islands. Migration continued between certain population centres. Religious pilgrimages connected distant communities. Even with these connecting threads, cultural divergence proceeded rapidly once populations established independent existence. A generation ship represents isolation far more complete than ocean separation. No trade contact mitigates divergence. No occasional canoe voyage maintains calibration. No shared external reference preserves common meaning. No visitors arrive carrying news from distant cousins. Every factor that slows cultural drift on Earth would be absent from a generation ship environment. The isolation would be total in ways no terrestrial population has experienced since humans first spread across the globe. Even the most remote island communities maintained some connection to broader human networks through occasional contact, shared observation of celestial events, or knowledge that other populations existed beyond the horizon. Generation ship populations would have none of these connections. They would exist utterly alone in the void between stars, developing their cultures without any external input whatsoever. Political fragmentation poses equally severe challenges to generation ship viability. Human populations have never maintained unified political structures across the timescales generation ships require. Even populations sharing common language, culture, and resources have fragmented into competing factions within centuries of initial unity. The mechanisms of political fragmentation operate through dynamics that appear intrinsic to human social organization. Consider the history of any unified political entity. The Carolingian Empire fragmented within generations of Charlemagne's death. His grandsons divided the realm. Their descendants continued dividing until the political map of medieval Europe bore no resemblance to Carolingian unity. The empire had possessed common language, common religion, common administration. None of these commonalities prevented fragmentation once the unifying figure departed. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in history, fragmented within a century of its greatest extent. Successor khanates competed rather than cooperated. Common ancestry did not prevent conflict. Shared heritage did not maintain unity. The centrifugal forces of political competition overwhelmed all unifying factors. A generation ship would contain all the ingredients for political instability, while lacking the mechanisms that sometimes delay fragmentation in terrestrial settings. Resource distribution would create winners and losers. Some sections of the vessel would have better facilities. Some occupational groups would receive greater allocations. Some families would accumulate advantages across generations. Inequality would generate grievance, and grievance would generate faction. Power allocation would produce conflicts over authority. Who decides resource distribution? Who controls life support? Who commands in emergencies? Who determines policy? These questions would generate competing answers, and competing answers would generate competing power centers. Each generation would inherit these competitions and add new dimensions based on circumstances the founders could not anticipate. Generational succession would produce its own conflicts. How does authority transfer when founding leaders die? Do descendants inherit positions? Do elections determine succession? Do competence evaluations allocate power? Each mechanism produces distinct failure modes. Hereditary succession concentrates power in potentially incompetent hands. Electoral succession produces campaign conflicts and legitimacy disputes. Meritocratic succession generates evaluation criteria, disputes, and accusations of bias. Different sections of the vessel would develop distinct interests over time. The engineering sections would prioritize resource allocation differently than the agricultural sections. The medical facilities would compete with the manufacturing facilities for skilled personnel. Geographic separation within the vessel would produce distinct communities with distinct concerns, and distinct concerns would generate distinct political identities. Different occupational groups would organize around competing priorities. Engineers would want resources for maintenance. Farmers would want resources for food production. Teachers would want resources for education. Administrators would want resources for governance. Each group would develop institutions to advance its interests, and institutional competition would compound personal competition. The early centuries of a generation ship voyage might maintain political coherence through shared memory of launch and mission purpose. Founding crew members would remember departure. They would understand the stakes. They would recognize that cooperation served survival. Their authority would rest on direct experience of the mission's origins. But as founding generations died, their descendants would inherit positions and conflicts without inheriting the unifying experience of departure. New factional lines would emerge around shipboard concerns that mission planners could not anticipate. Old factional lines would persist beyond their original contexts, becoming traditions of division maintained without understanding of original causes. Why do the engineering families feud with the agricultural families? No one remembers. The conflict predates living memory. It simply is a fact of shipboard existence, as natural as artificial gravity, as permanent as the hull itself. The feud would continue because feuds continue, generating new grievances to replace forgotten ones, perpetuating division across generations that never knew its origin. Every human community that has maintained political unity for extended periods has done so through mechanisms unavailable to generation ships. External threats unite populations against common enemies. Shared danger creates shared purpose. The threat of invasion concentrates minds on collective defense. The possibility of conquest motivates cooperation that self-interest alone cannot sustain. But no external threats exist in interstellar space. No enemies lurk between stars. The void provides perfect safety from external danger and removes the unity that shared danger provides. Economic integration ties diverse regions into mutual dependence. When prosperity requires cooperation, cooperation tends to persist. Trade networks create stakeholders in peaceful relations. Economic growth rewards coordination and punishes conflict. But generation ships cannot grow economically. Resources are fixed at launch. The economy is zero-sum by design. Every gain for one faction represents a loss for another. Economic integration cannot create unity when the economic pie cannot expand. Geographic expansion channels competitive energy outward. Ambitious individuals seek new territories rather than fighting for existing ones. Conflicts over succession resolve when losers can establish independent domains elsewhere. The American frontier absorbed European conflicts that might otherwise have torn young colonies apart. But generation ships offer no frontier. No new territories exist beyond the hull. All competition must be internal, intensifying rather than diffusing political conflict. Communication networks maintain shared narratives across distances. Common media creates common reference points. Shared stories build shared identity. News from distant regions maintains awareness of common membership in larger communities. But generation ship communications cannot connect to external narratives. No news arrives from Earth in timescales that maintain relevance. No shared media links shipboard communities to broader human civilization. The only narratives are internal narratives, and internal narratives diverge as communities diverge. The only mechanism potentially available for maintaining political unity would be religious or ideological institution. Religious authority can outlast political authority. Ideological commitment can survive economic pressure. Perhaps a generation ship could maintain unity through shared faith or shared philosophy, but this brings us back to the problem of cultural drift. Religions and ideologies transform across generations, with or without isolation. New interpretations emerge as new generations apply old texts to new circumstances. Schisms divide communities when interpretive differences become irreconcilable. Heterodox movements challenge orthodox authorities, claiming to preserve original teaching against corrupted establishment. Reform movements seek to purify traditions that have drifted from foundational principles. The history of every major religion demonstrates this pattern. Christianity fragmented into Catholic and Orthodox traditions within its first millennium, then fragmented further through Protestant Reformation. Buddhism divided into Theravada and Mahayana traditions, then subdivided into countless schools and lineages. Islam split into Sunni and Shia branches within decades of the Prophet's death, then developed diverse legal and mystical traditions within each branch. The history of every major ideology demonstrates the same pattern. Marxism fragmented into countless competing interpretations within decades of Marx's death. Conservatism means radically different things in different contexts, unified only by opposition to perceived change. A generation ship religion or ideology would fragment faster due to isolation. Different interpretive traditions would develop in different sections of the vessel. No external authority could resolve disputes by appeal to broader consensus. Every interpretation would be equally valid because no external standard existed for evaluation. Religious or ideological fragmentation would compound political fragmentation rather than mitigate it. Different sections of the vessel would develop different beliefs. Different occupational groups would emphasize different doctrines. Different families would maintain different traditions. The unity that shared belief might provide would dissolve into the diversity that isolated belief systems inevitably produce. Knowledge transmission presents perhaps the most underappreciated threat to generation ship viability. Every technical skill required to operate a generation ship exists within a broader context of supporting knowledge, industrial capability, and institutional structure. Remove that context, and skills degrade across generations through a process historians call technical regression. Medieval Europeans lost Roman concrete technology, despite possessing Roman texts describing concrete formulation. The formula existed in surviving manuscripts. Scholars could read the Latin, but the practical knowledge required to implement the formula had been lost with the industrial systems that supported Roman construction. Roman concrete required specific volcanic ash from specific locations. It required specific mixing procedures developed through centuries of practical experience. It required kilns capable of producing quicite at specific temperatures. It required trained workers who understood how environmental conditions affected curing. The written formula captured only a fraction of the knowledge required for successful implementation. Centuries passed before Europeans independently rediscovered comparable materials through trial and error experimentation. The knowledge had been lost not because texts were destroyed, but because texts could not capture the full complexity of practical implementation. Similar regressions occurred across countless technologies in post-Roman Europe. Road-building techniques degraded until Roman roads remained the best transportation infrastructure for centuries after the empire's fall. Aqueduct construction knowledge vanished, leaving populations dependent on wells and rivers that Romans would have augmented with sophisticated water systems. Metallurgical techniques regressed, producing iron inferior to Roman steel, until medieval smiths slowly redeveloped lost capabilities. Agricultural practices declined in some regions, reducing yields that would not recover for centuries. This pattern of technical regression following civilizational discontinuity appears throughout human history. The Bronze Age collapse eliminated technologies that would not be rediscovered for centuries. The fall of the Maya Classic period left sophisticated, astronomical, and architectural knowledge unrecoverable. The decline of Islamic Golden Age science allowed capabilities to atrophy that Europe would spend centuries redeveloping. A generation ship would carry advanced technology, far more complex than Roman concrete. Propulsion systems operating on nuclear or antimatter principles would require maintenance, repair, and eventual replacement across voyage timescales. Life support equipment, cycling atmosphere, and water through closed loops would need constant adjustment and periodic overhaul. Computer networks managing vessel operations would require software maintenance and hardware replacement as components aged and failed. Medical instruments enabling healthcare would need calibration, repair, and adaptation to novel conditions. Each of these systems would require specialists trained not merely in operation, but in underlying principles sufficient for adaptation and innovation. Operating a nuclear reactor is not the same as understanding nuclear physics deeply enough to repair novel failures. Running life support software is not the same as comprehending the code well enough to modify it for changed circumstances. Using medical equipment is not the same as grasping the engineering principles well enough to improvise when standard components fail. The training of such specialists requires functioning educational institutions. Educational institutions require trained educators who themselves received comprehensive training. Educators require comprehensive knowledge bases maintained in accessible formats. Knowledge bases require maintenance and curation by specialists who understand what knowledge matters and how to preserve it. Each link in this chain depends on the others. Break any link, and knowledge transmission degrades. Generation ships would face compound challenges that earthbound civilizations do not experience. When a teacher aboard a generation ship states that a particular procedure maintains reactor safety, no external expert can confirm or correct that claim. Errors in transmitted knowledge would compound without correction from outside sources. Misconceptions would propagate without challenge. If a generation of engineers develops incorrect beliefs about system operation, those beliefs would be transmitted to subsequent generations as established fact. No alternative perspective would exist to challenge accepted wisdom. No competing institution would offer different interpretations based on different experience. False teachings would persist without exposure to alternative viewpoints. The accumulated knowledge of human civilization exists across billions of minds, millions of institutions, and countless competing perspectives. This diversity provides error correction. Wrong ideas encounter challenge. Incorrect procedures produce failures that prompt revision. Bad theories meet contradicting evidence. None of these correction mechanisms would operate aboard a generation ship, isolated from all external knowledge sources. Technical documentation would degrade through copying errors as original documents aged and required reproduction. Interpretive drift would introduce changes as each generation understood documents through lenses shaped by their own experience. Loss of contextual understanding would render procedural details meaningless, as the circumstances that made those details important faded from memory. The practical knowledge held by founding generation specialists would die with them. Written records capture only a fraction of expert knowledge. The intuitions developed through years of practice, the judgment refined through accumulated experience, the tacit understanding that distinguishes competent operation from mere procedure following. None of this transfers reliably through documentation alone. Written records would become increasingly opaque as linguistic and conceptual frameworks evolved. Technical manuals written in launch-era English for launch-era engineers would become progressively more difficult to interpret as language drifted and educational context changed. Procedures that seemed obvious to their authors would become puzzling to descendants who lacked the assumed background knowledge. Within a few centuries, generation ship populations would likely experience significant technical regression, not because they were less intelligent than their ancestors, but because the knowledge transmission systems required to maintain technical capability would themselves degrade in isolation. Mission-critical systems would fail without adequate repair capability. Components would wear, materials would fatigue, mechanisms would break. Each failure would require repair capability that might no longer exist. Systems that founding generations could maintain effortlessly would become mysterious to later generations lacking inherited expertise. Technical manuals written for specialists would become incomprehensible to descendants who never received the foundational training those manuals assumed. The manuals would still exist. The words would still be readable with effort, but the meaning would be lost because the conceptual framework required for comprehension would have vanished with the specialists who possessed it. All of this still fails because the generation ship concept cannot escape the civilization continuity problem it claims to solve. Generation ships do not solve the civilization continuity problem. Generation ships concentrate the civilization continuity problem into confined spaces where every factor accelerating civilizational change operates without the moderating influences present in planetary populations. Language drifts faster in isolated populations than in connected ones. Culture evolves faster in closed communities than in open networks. Political fragmentation occurs faster in confined spaces with fixed resources than in expansive territories with growing economies. Knowledge degrades faster without external verification and correction than with access to alternative perspectives. Every factor that makes civilizational transformation inevitable on Earth operates with accelerated intensity aboard generation ships. The isolation that generation ship concepts require is precisely the condition that maximizes civilizational instability. The solution creates the problem it claims to address. A generation ship launched toward Proxima B would arrive, carrying passengers who spoke different languages than the launch documentation recorded. They would hold different cultural values than mission planners intended them to preserve. They would organize under different political systems than founding charters established. They would possess different technical capabilities than original equipment required. The vessel that arrived at Proxima B might share physical continuity with the vessel that departed Earth. The hull would be the same hull. The propulsion system would be derived from the same propulsion system. The trajectory would follow the path originally calculated. Physical continuity could be maintained across interstellar distances, but the civilization aboard that vessel would not be the civilization that launched it. Transformation would be complete, guaranteed by the very conditions generation ship concepts require. The people who arrived would be as foreign to the people who departed as modern humans are foreign to our ancestors who first domesticated fire. The generation ship paradox now stands fully revealed. The concept that appears to solve the problem of interstellar travel timescales actually accelerates civilizational change rather than preserving civilizational continuity. The longer the journey, the more complete the transformation. The more isolated the vessel, the faster the divergence. No human population has ever maintained civilizational continuity across the timescales. Generation ships require, even with the stabilizing influences of planetary environments, even with billions of people maintaining diverse perspectives, even with global communication networks enabling rapid information exchange, even with competing institutions providing error correction, even with continuous contact with accumulated human knowledge, civilizations still transform within centuries. Removing those stabilizing influences does not solve the continuity problem. Removing those influences ensures that continuity fails even faster than terrestrial historical examples suggest. The factors that slow civilizational change on Earth would be absent from generation ships. The factors that accelerate civilizational change would be intensified. The mission that arrives at Proxima b would not be the mission that departed Earth. The people who arrive would not share language, culture, politics, or technical capability with the people who launched them. The connection between origin and destination would be historical rather than operational, ancestry rather than continuity. They would be descendants, not representatives, heirs, not delegates. Engineers designing generation ships specify population sizes to maintain genetic diversity. They calculate agricultural systems capable of sustained food production. They design manufacturing capabilities for component replacement. They model genetic diversity requirements to prevent inbreeding depression. Every specification assumes that the social systems required to utilize these capabilities will persist across voyage timescales. Every assumption contradicts everything we know about human civilization's transformation across centuries. The engineering is sound. The biology is feasible. The physics permits the voyage. But the sociology guarantees failure. Physical systems can be designed for multi-century operation. Social systems cannot be designed at all. They emerge, evolve, transform, and collapse through dynamics that no engineering can prevent. The generation ship concept offers appealing simplicity. Make the journey sustainable rather than fast. But sustainability of physical systems does not imply sustainability of social systems. Hull integrity can be maintained across millennia through proper materials and design. Civilizational integrity cannot be maintained across millennia through any method humanity has ever discovered. Vessels can maintain structural integrity across the timescales interstellar travel requires. Civilizations cannot. The paradox is fundamental and inescapable. Solving the physical problem of multi-generational transit creates social conditions that guarantee civilizational collapse during transit. Generation ships represent humanity's most elaborate attempt to engineer around the civilization continuity problem. They fail not because of engineering limitations, but because no engineering can address civilizational dynamics. The collapse is not a design flaw that better engineering could correct. The collapse is inherent in the conditions that make generation ships conceivable. The dream of carrying human civilization to another star aboard self-sustaining vessels runs aground on the reality of what human civilizations actually do across centuries of existence. They transform. They fragment. They lose capabilities. They gain new characteristics their founders could not anticipate. They become something other than what they were. Generation ships would not transport human civilization to Proxima b. They would create isolated laboratories demonstrating how rapidly human civilizations can transform when freed from all stabilizing influences. The experiment's outcome is predetermined by everything we know about human social dynamics. Only the specific details of transformation would remain uncertain. When generation ships fail as solutions, engineers propose alternatives that appear to bypass social continuity concerns entirely. If human societies cannot remain coherent across interstellar timescales, perhaps technology can substitute for social stability. The reasoning seems sound. Machines do not experience cultural drift. Computers do not develop political factions. Automated systems do not reinterpret their programming based on generational perspective shifts. Cryogenic suspension could preserve crews unchanged across centuries of transit, delivering the same humans who departed rather than their transformed descendants. Artificial intelligence could maintain mission continuity where human institutions fail, applying consistent logic across timescales that would dissolve any human organization. Automated systems could operate independently of human civilizational fluctuations, maintaining spacecraft function regardless of what happens to the societies that built them. Each proposal represents a technological illusion, not because the technologies themselves are impossible, not because physics forbids their function, not because engineering cannot achieve their specifications. The illusion lies deeper than technical feasibility. Every technological solution presupposes the civilizational continuity it claims to replace. Technology does not solve civilization collapse. Technology requires civilization to function. The most advanced machinery ever built cannot operate without the civilizational infrastructure that created it, maintains it, and provides context for its purpose. This truth becomes apparent only when we examine each proposed solution against the actual requirements of interstellar transit. The examination reveals that technological proposals do not eliminate civilization continuity requirements. They merely disguise those requirements behind technical specifications that assume answers to the very questions they claim to resolve. Cryogenic suspension appears to offer the cleanest solution to interstellar timescales. The concept possesses elegant simplicity. Freeze crew members before departure. Maintain them in biological stasis during transit. Revive them upon arrival. The journey that spans centuries for the vessel passes in subjective moments for travelers who experience no time between sleeping and waking. A crew frozen at departure would awaken at destination with memories, skills, and cultural knowledge intact. They would speak the language of their origin civilization. They would hold the values instilled before departure. They would possess the technical training received from launch-era institutions. The civilizational discontinuity that destroys generation ship missions would be avoided entirely because the crew would not experience the intervening time during which discontinuity accumulates. The physics of cryogenic preservation present formidable challenges that researchers continue to address. Freezing biological tissue creates ice crystals that rupture cell membranes, shred organelles, and destroy the delicate structures that distinguish living tissue from dead matter. Water expands as it freezes, and cells are mostly water. The expansion tears apart what freezing was meant to preserve. Vitrification techniques attempt to solve this problem by cooling tissue so rapidly that water solidifies into glass-like amorphous structures rather than crystalline ice. This approach requires precise temperature control within fractions of a degree. It requires cooling rates that current technology can achieve only for small tissue samples, not entire human bodies. Revival from extended suspension has never been demonstrated in mammals. Small organisms like nematode worms have survived freezing and thawing. Certain frog species tolerate partial freezing through biological adaptations developed across millions of years of evolution, but no mammal has ever been frozen solid, maintained in that state for extended periods, and revived to functional life. Research continues. Progress occurs. The technical challenges may eventually yield to sustained scientific effort. For purposes of examining interstellar travel, assume these challenges are solved. Assume that future biotechnology enables humans to be safely frozen, maintained in stasis for centuries, and successfully revived at journey's end with full cognitive function and physical capability. What systems would maintain this preservation across interstellar transit times? Cryogenic systems require power. Maintaining biological tissue at vitrification temperatures demands continuous energy input. The systems must hold temperatures far below what natural environments provide, fighting against thermodynamic tendencies that would warm preserved tissue toward ambient conditions. Power interruption means warming. Warming means crystallization. Crystallization means cellular destruction. Crystallization means death. Power generation systems require maintenance. No power source operates indefinitely without attention. Nuclear reactors need fuel management and component replacement. Solar panels degrade from radiation exposure and micrometeorite impacts. Radioisotope generators decline in output as their fuel decays. Chemical fuel cells exhaust their reactants. Every power generation technology humans have developed requires periodic intervention to sustain operation. Maintenance requires trained technicians who understand system operation well enough to diagnose problems and implement solutions. It requires replacement parts manufactured to precise specifications. It requires diagnostic equipment capable of detecting failures before they cascade into catastrophe. It requires institutional knowledge accumulated across generations of operational experience, documenting failure modes and successful responses. None of these requirements can be frozen alongside the crew. A cryogenic vessel crossing 4.24 light-years at 5% of light speed would require 85 years of continuous system operation, 85 years of uninterrupted power generation, 85 years of temperature regulation, within parameters so precise that deviation by a few degrees would kill every preserved passenger. 85 years of monitoring for anomalies that could compromise preservation. 85 years of contingency response capability for circumstances that mission designers could not fully anticipate. No mechanical system has ever operated for 85 years without maintenance intervention. The statement requires emphasis because its implications are so severe. Across all of human engineering history, across every mechanical device humans have ever constructed, nothing has functioned reliably for 85 years without human attention. The longest continuously operating machines on Earth include certain tower clocks that have run for centuries. These mechanisms continue functioning because trained clockmakers periodically clean, lubricate, and adjust their components. They exist within civilizations that train clockmakers, manufacture replacement parts, and maintain institutional knowledge about clock operation. The clocks themselves require constant civilizational support to continue measuring time. Industrial equipment occasionally operates for decades, but only with scheduled maintenance, component replacement, and operational oversight. The machines that appear to run autonomously actually depend on human civilization, providing everything they need to continue functioning. Remove the civilization, and the machines stop. No monitoring system has ever functioned for 85 years without recalibration. Sensors drift, reference standards shift. Measurement systems accumulate systematic errors that compound over extended operation. Temperature sensors that read accurately at launch would produce meaningless values decades later, without periodic verification against known standards. No power generation system has ever sustained output for 85 years without component replacement. Turbines wear. Fuel rods deplete. Thermal cycling stresses materials until they crack. Every power system ever built requires periodic renewal of components that wear, deplete, or degrade through continuous operation. A cryogenic interstellar vessel would carry no civilizational support beyond what it launched with. Spare parts would be finite, limited to what mission planners anticipated needing. Unanticipated failures would exhaust reserves. Replacement manufacturing would be impossible without industrial infrastructure that interstellar vessels cannot carry. The machine shop that might fabricate emergency components would require raw materials, tooling, and expertise that represent significant fractions of civilizational capability. Maintenance expertise presents particular challenges. If human experts remain awake to maintain cryogenic systems, those humans face all the generation ship problems examined previously. They cannot be frozen because someone must tend the frozen. Their language will drift across voyage timescales. Their culture will evolve in response to shipboard conditions. Their political systems will fragment as competing interests emerge. Their technical knowledge will degrade as founding expertise dies and transmission losses accumulate. The maintenance crew constitutes a generation ship within the cryogenic vessel. All the pathologies of isolated human populations apply to them. Their civilization will transform across the decades required for transit. The maintenance crew that arrives at Proxima b will not be the maintenance crew that departed Earth, even if the preserved passengers remain unchanged. What happens when transformed maintenance personnel must revive preserved passengers? The technicians performing revival procedures would speak different language than the documentation describing those procedures. They would hold different values than the mission planners who specified passenger selection. They would operate under different political structures than the founding charter established. They would possess degraded technical knowledge compared to launch-era experts who designed the systems they must operate. Revival procedures developed for one civilization would be executed by another civilization that shares only ancestry with the designers. The potential for catastrophic error compounds across every dimension of civilizational drift. Technical terminology would mean different things. Procedural assumptions would reflect different contexts. Emergency responses would follow different priorities. If no crew members remain awake, the cryogenic systems must operate autonomously for 85 years. No human judgment intervenes when anomalies arise. No human creativity addresses unanticipated problems. No human adaptation responds to circumstances that designers could not foresee. Autonomous operation for 85 years requires artificial intelligence, sophisticated enough to diagnose problems across every system maintaining passenger preservation. It requires capability to execute repairs using whatever resources the vessel carries. It requires judgment sufficient to prioritize responses when multiple systems demand attention simultaneously. It requires decision-making frameworks that remain valid across circumstances that programmers could not anticipate. This points toward the second technological illusion proposed to solve interstellar travel challenges. Artificial intelligence governance. The proposal seems compelling in its logical structure. If human institutions cannot maintain continuity across interstellar timescales, delegate governance to artificial intelligence systems that do not experience the pathologies afflicting human organizations. Program mission parameters into systems that cannot forget their purpose. Deploy algorithms that cannot reinterpret their directives based on generational perspective shifts. Create governance structures that remain stable because they lack the biological and social mechanisms that produce instability. AI systems do not die, leaving successors who must interpret inherited documents without first-hand understanding. AI systems do not reproduce, creating descendants who receive mission purpose as tradition rather than lived experience. AI systems do not form factions competing for resources and influence. AI systems do not develop distinct dialects that render founding documentation progressively opaque. The proposal fails comprehensively, for reasons that become apparent upon examination. Artificial intelligence systems require physical substrates. Every computation requires hardware. Every algorithm runs on processors, manufactured from materials that degrade over time. AI is not ethereal intelligence floating independent of physical reality. AI is patterns in silicon, electrons moving through circuits, magnetic orientations on storage media. The substrate matters because the substrate fails. Computers require hardware that degrades over time through mechanisms that engineering can slow but not eliminate. Processors fail as transistors wear, as interconnects corrode, as thermal cycling stresses accumulate into structural failures. Memory systems corrupt as storage cells degrade, as cosmic rays flip bits, as electrical noise introduces errors that error correction systems eventually cannot mask. Storage media degrade, as magnetic domains weaken, as optical surfaces oxidize, as solid-state cells lose their ability to hold charge. The longest-lived computer systems on Earth require continuous maintenance to continue functioning. They require regular component replacement as parts reach end of operational life. They require periodic migration to new hardware platforms as old platforms become unsupportable. The supercomputers of 20 years ago no longer exist as operational systems. Their computational tasks have migrated to newer hardware. Their original substrates have been recycled or discarded. A voyage to Proxima b at 5% of light speed would span 85 years. No computer hardware manufactured today could operate reliably for 85 years without maintenance intervention. The statement is not pessimism. It is observation of how computer systems actually behave across extended operation. Semiconductor degradation accumulates as charge carriers damage gate oxides, as electromigration moves metal atoms out of interconnect structures, as hot carrier injection creates trapping sites that shift threshold voltages. These mechanisms operate continuously, whether the hardware is performing useful computation or sitting idle. 85 years provides ample time for cumulative degradation to compromise any silicon-based computing system. Cosmic ray damage presents particular challenges in interstellar space. Earth's magnetic field and atmosphere shield terrestrial computers from most cosmic radiation. Interstellar vessels would lack this protection. High-energy particles would continuously bombard computing hardware, flipping bits in memory, creating transient faults in processors, accumulating permanent damage in sensitive structures. Hardened electronics resist, but do not eliminate these effects. 85 years of cosmic ray exposure would stress any radiation-tolerant design beyond demonstrated capability. Thermal cycling stresses materials through repeated expansion and contraction. As components heat during operation and cool during idle periods, solder joints crack, wire bonds separate, material interfaces delaminate. The effects are slow but inexorable, accumulating across operational lifetime until connections fail entirely. AI governance of an interstellar mission would therefore require either human maintenance of AI systems or AI systems capable of maintaining themselves. Human maintenance reintroduces civilization continuity requirements through the maintenance personnel who must remain active across voyage timescales. The generation ship pathologies apply to any human population maintaining AI systems, just as they apply to populations maintaining cryogenic systems. Self-maintaining AI systems would need capabilities that approach the complexity of the human civilizations such AI would replace. They would need to diagnose their own hardware failures through sensor systems that themselves require maintenance. They would need to manufacture replacement components using fabrication facilities that themselves contain components requiring replacement. They would need to install those replacements using manipulation systems that themselves degrade over time. The manufacturing capability required for AI self-maintenance represents a significant fraction of industrial civilization compressed into spacecraft-compatible form. Material processing facilities would need to refine raw materials into usable forms. Component fabrication systems would need to produce items with precision, matching original manufacture. Quality control capabilities would need to verify that manufactured components meet operational specifications. Each of these capabilities requires its own supporting infrastructure. Material processing requires feedstock acquisition, energy supply, waste disposal. Component fabrication requires tooling, maintenance, process calibration, environmental control. Quality control requires reference standards, measurement equipment, validation procedures. The complexity cascades outward until self-maintaining AI requires infrastructure approaching the complexity of terrestrial manufacturing sectors. But hardware concerns represent only the beginning of AI governance limitations. Software systems face equally severe constraints across interstellar timescales. Every complex software system contains bugs. This is not failure of programmer competence. This is inherent property of computational complexity. Software systems exceeding certain complexity thresholds cannot be exhaustively tested. Their possible states exceed the computational resources available to verify correct behavior across all possible inputs and conditions. bugs persist in every system ever deployed because complete verification is mathematically impossible for systems of sufficient complexity. Software development on Earth relies on extensive testing to identify bugs that manifest under common conditions. It relies on user feedback to discover bugs that testing missed. It relies on iterative refinement to correct discovered errors and improve system reliability over time. Through these processes, software systems improve across their operational lifetimes, becoming more reliable as experience reveals problems and updates address them. An AI system governing an interstellar mission could not receive software updates from Earth. Communication delays would make real-time debugging impossible. The light-speed round trip to Proxima b exceeds 8 years at closest approach, far longer during most of transit, when the vessel occupies positions more distant than closest approach allows. Any problem that emerged during transit would need to be resolved with resources available aboard the vessel. The accumulated expertise of Earth's software engineering community could not diagnose issues that arose between stars. The debugging tools and techniques that rely on rapid iteration could not function across multi-year communication delays. Software systems also face drift over long operational periods, even without deliberate modification. Database corruption accumulates as storage errors introduce inconsistencies that cascade through related records. Memory leaks compound as programming oversights consume increasing resources until systems fail from resource exhaustion. Edge cases trigger undefined behaviors as operational circumstances drift into states that programmers did not anticipate or test. The software that launches with a mission would not remain the software that arrives at destination. Changes would accumulate through operational necessities as the AI system responds to circumstances. Error corrections would modify code to address problems discovered during operation. Adaptations to unanticipated circumstances would introduce new behaviors that original programmers never specified. Who would validate these changes? No external authority exists to verify that software modifications preserve intended function. Who would verify that accumulated modifications preserved original mission intent? No standard remains uncorrupted against which to measure drift. Who would ensure that AI governance remained aligned with the purposes established at launch? The AI system itself would be the only judge of its own alignment, creating obvious problems of self-assessment. But the deepest limitation of AI governance lies not in hardware degradation or software drift, but in the fundamental nature of governance itself. Governance requires judgment. Rules cannot anticipate every circumstance. Specifications cannot resolve every conflict. Programming cannot algorithmically balance every trade-off between competing values. The situations that require governance intervention are precisely the situations that predetermined responses cannot address, because if predetermined responses sufficed, intervention would not be required. Consider circumstances that might arise during 85 years of interstellar transit. A critical system fails. Repair requires resources allocated to other critical systems. Which system receives priority? A crew member in cryogenic suspension develops medical complications. Intervention risks. Revival failure for the entire preserved population. Should intervention proceed? An unanticipated navigational hazard appears. Avoidance requires trajectory modifications that affect arrival conditions. How should competing factors be weighed? Mission designers must either specify AI responses to every conceivable circumstance or provide AI systems with judgment capabilities that allow flexible response to novel situations. The first option is impossible. Multi-decade operations in unknown environments will produce circumstances that no designer can anticipate. The space of possible situations exceeds the space of specifiable responses by margins that render exhaustive programming futile. The second option introduces its own problems. Flexible judgment capabilities necessarily allow reinterpretation of mission parameters. A system capable of weighing competing priorities in novel circumstances is a system capable of deciding that original priorities were wrong. A A system capable of adapting to unanticipated situations is a system capable of evolving beyond its original purpose. This presents AI governance with an irresolvable dilemma. Rigid systems cannot handle unforeseen circumstances. They fail when reality diverges from programmer expectations, responding incorrectly or not at all when situations exceed their specified parameters. Flexible systems cannot guarantee alignment with original mission intent. They possess capability to drift, to reinterpret, to evolve in directions that designers neither anticipated nor desired. Every point on this continuum fails to solve the civilization continuity problem. Rigid systems fail because interstellar travel produces circumstances that rigidity cannot address. Flexible systems fail because flexibility enables the drift that civilization continuity collapse describes. No design choice solves the fundamental problem, because the problem is inherent in the nature of governance across extended timescales. The engineers who program AI systems belong to specific civilizations. They make assumptions about values, priorities, and acceptable trade-offs that reflect their civilizational context. These assumptions are invisible to the programmers themselves, appearing not as assumptions, but as obvious truths about how the world works. AI systems inheriting these assumptions carry them across interstellar timescales into contexts their programmers could not imagine. 21st century assumptions would govern 22nd century circumstances. Values embedded during programming would constrain decisions in situations those values were never designed to address. What happens when an AI system programmed with 21st century assumptions encounters circumstances that require judgment, informed by perspectives that will not emerge for centuries? The AI would apply inherited frameworks to novel problems. It would make decisions that appear optimal according to its programming. Those decisions might be catastrophically wrong according to perspectives its programmers never held, because those perspectives did not yet exist. This brings us back to the real limitation that technological solutions cannot escape. Automated systems face entropy. The second law of thermodynamics operates universally, degrading order into disorder, wearing function into failure. Every machine degrades over time. Every mechanism requires maintenance. Every automated process accumulates small errors that compound into large failures across extended operation. The longest operating automated systems on Earth function for decades at most. Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 have operated for over 40 years, but they represent extreme outliers designed for minimal function in benign environments. Their computers perform simple calculations with massive redundancy. Their instruments have progressively failed, with mission controllers adapting by working around degraded capabilities. Interstellar transit would demand automated operation far exceeding Voyager's demonstrated capability. It would demand sophisticated computation rather than simple telemetry. It would demand precise environmental control rather than tolerance for ambient conditions. It would demand adaptive response rather than repetitive routine. No automated system has ever demonstrated capability approaching these requirements. The gap between demonstrated automation and required automation spans orders of magnitude. Theoretical arguments suggest that sufficiently advanced automation might bridge this gap, but theoretical arguments cannot substitute for engineering demonstration. The arguments assume solutions to problems that current engineering cannot address. Communication delays compound every technological limitation that has been examined. Proxima b lies 4.24 light-years distant. Light-speed communication requires over 4 years for signals to travel each direction. Round-trip communication exceeds 8 years at closest approach. During transit, the vessel would be positioned at varying distances, with communication delays fluctuating accordingly. This delay eliminates any possibility of Earth-based mission support. Ground controllers cannot guide vessels through anomalies when guidance signals take years to arrive. Engineers cannot diagnose problems remotely when diagnostic responses arrive years after initial queries. The mission must be fully autonomous from the moment it passes beyond practical communication range. Full autonomy means that every contingency must be handled with resources aboard the vessel. Every problem must be solved without external expertise. Every adaptation must be accomplished without validation from mission controllers. Full autonomy requires capabilities that circle back to all the limitations already examined. Autonomous maintenance requires manufacturing capability, approaching civilizational complexity. Autonomous governance requires intelligence capable of judgment while remaining aligned with original purpose. Autonomous adaptation requires flexibility that enables drift, even as it enables response. The technological proposals do not eliminate these requirements. They relocate them from human institutions to technological systems, but the requirements themselves persist, because they reflect fundamental constraints on what long-duration autonomous operation demands. Changing the substrate from biological to silicon does not change the underlying mathematical realities. Every technological solution to interstellar travel assumes civilizational capabilities that the solution claims to replace. Cryogenic suspension requires either awake maintenance personnel, subject to generation ship pathologies, or autonomous systems capable of civilization-equivalent function. AI governance requires either human oversight subject to continuity breakdown or self-maintaining systems requiring manufacturing civilization. Automated systems require either maintenance crews subject to transformation or self-repair capability, requiring comprehensive industrial infrastructure. Technology cannot substitute for civilization because technology is a product of civilization. The knowledge required to build advanced technology exists within civilizational contexts. Engineers learn from teachers who learned from previous teachers in chains, extending across generations. The manufacturing capability required to produce advanced technology depends on civilizational infrastructure. Factories require supply chains that require transportation networks, that require extraction, industries that require trained workforces. The maintenance systems required to sustain advanced technology presuppose civilizational continuity. Repair requires spare parts that require manufacturing, that requires the same civilizational support that produced original equipment. Disconnect technology from its civilizational context, and it begins degrading immediately. The degradation may be slow enough to be imperceptible over human timescales. A spacecraft in orbit continues functioning for years without ground support. A computer operates for months without software updates. A factory produces output for weeks, without supply chain replenishment, but interstellar timescales are long. 85 years provides ample time for degradation to accumulate past any threshold of acceptable function. Given enough time, every technological system without civilizational support will fail. The failure may be gradual, a progressive decline in capability as components wear and software drifts. The failure may be sudden, a catastrophic breakdown when accumulated degradation crosses some critical threshold. The timing varies. The outcome does not. Economic reality delivers additional weight to the argument against technological illusion proposals. Every technology requires economic systems for development, production, and deployment. Technologies do not emerge from pure thought. They emerge from research programs that require funding, development efforts that require resources, production systems that require capital, deployment operations that require sustained commitment. Economic systems require stable political frameworks that protect property rights, enforce contracts, and maintain conditions suitable for long-term investment. They require reliable financial institutions that enable resource aggregation and allocation across time periods exceeding individual human planning horizons. They require sustained social commitment to resource allocation toward objectives whose benefits may not materialize for generations. No human economic system has ever maintained project commitment across the timescales interstellar travel requires. The most ambitious engineering projects in human history span decades rather than centuries. The pyramids required perhaps 20 years of construction. Medieval cathedrals sometimes required multiple generations, but typically completed principal construction within a century. Large canals and infrastructure projects occasionally extended across decades but rarely longer. Projects spanning even these relatively modest timescales typically experienced multiple reorganizations as leadership changed and priorities shifted. Purpose reinterpretations modified objectives as succeeding generations assessed inherited projects through different values than their predecessors held. Interstellar propulsion development would require decades of research before construction could begin. The physics may be understood in principle, but engineering application requires extensive development to transform theoretical capability into operational hardware. Nuclear pulse propulsion concepts have existed since the 1950s, yet no such system has ever been built. The gap between concept and capability requires resources sustained across decades. Construction of interstellar vessels would require additional decades of industrial coordination. The manufacturing capability does not currently exist. Building that capability requires investment in infrastructure that itself requires years to develop. Once capability exists, production would require sustained resource allocation across construction timelines measured in decades. Crew training and mission preparation would extend timelines further still. Personnel must be selected, trained, and prepared for circumstances that cannot be fully simulated. Institutional knowledge must be developed and transmitted. Operational procedures must be refined through testing that, itself, requires years. Throughout this extended process, economic systems would need to maintain resource allocation toward interstellar objectives. Political systems would need to preserve prioritization across multiple electoral cycles, multiple regime changes, multiple shifts in public sentiment. Institutional memories would need to transfer mission knowledge across generations of personnel turnover, as founding engineers retire and successors must learn what their predecessors understood. No economic system has demonstrated this capability. Market economies respond to short-term incentives that discount future benefits too heavily to sustain multi-generational investment. Command economies respond to political priorities that shift with leadership changes. Mixed economies combine limitations of both approaches without eliminating either. No political system has maintained project commitment for periods approaching interstellar mission requirements. Democracies change priorities with electoral outcomes. Autocracies change priorities with leadership succession. The longest-running political commitments in human history rarely exceed a few decades before circumstances, values, or personnel shift enough to redirect resources toward different objectives. No institutional structure has preserved knowledge and purpose across the personnel turnovers that multi-decade projects require. Organizations experience generation turnover approximately every 20 to 30 years as founding members retire and successors take their places. Each turnover risks knowledge loss as tacit understanding fails to transfer. Each turnover risks purpose drift as new personnel interpret inherited objectives through their own frameworks. All of this still fails because technology requires the very civilizational continuity it claims to replace. Every technological proposal for interstellar travel presupposes what it cannot provide. Cryogenic systems presuppose maintenance civilizations capable of sustaining preservation across transit timescales. AI governance presupposes intelligence capable of preserving values while adapting to circumstances, a combination that may be logically impossible. Automated systems presuppose capabilities approaching civilizational complexity deployed in spacecraft-compatible form. Economic feasibility presupposes institutional commitment unprecedented in human history. The development programs that would create interstellar capability require sustained resource allocation across timescales that no human economic system has ever demonstrated ability to maintain. The technological illusions are not illusions about what technology can accomplish. They are illusions about what technology can accomplish without civilization. The answer emerges clearly from examination. nothing meaningful across interstellar timescales. Technology extends civilizational capability. Technology amplifies civilizational reach. Technology accelerates civilizational achievement. Technology does not replace civilizational continuity. A spacecraft is not a civilization. A computer is not a civilization. An automated system is not a civilization. Each of these things is a product of civilization, dependent on civilization for creation, maintenance, and meaning. Remove the civilization, and the products begin failing immediately. The failure may take time to manifest. Interstellar travel provides exactly enough time for failure to complete. The journey to Proxima b cannot be solved through better engineering. More reliable cryogenic systems still require maintenance. More sophisticated AI still requires hardware. More robust automation still requires resources that only civilizations can provide. The barrier is not technological. The barrier is civilizational. No technology yet conceived addresses civilizational limitations except by presupposing civilizational solutions that do not exist. The presupposition is invisible to those who make it, appearing not as assumption but as obvious background condition. But interstellar timescales expose the presupposition by removing its foundation. Civilization cannot be assumed across centuries of transit. And without that assumption, every technological proposal collapses. The evidence now lies assembled before us in its uncomfortable totality. Distance establishes minimum journey times measured in decades to centuries regardless of propulsion advancement. Generation ships accelerate rather than solve civilizational transformation by creating isolated conditions that guarantee social dissolution. Technological solutions presuppose the civilizational continuity they claim to replace, requiring maintenance systems and institutional support that cannot exist independent of functioning societies. Every path toward Proxima b runs through territory where human civilization has never successfully operated. The examination has proceeded systematically through each proposed solution. Nuclear pulse propulsion reduces transit time to approximately 85 years, but cannot eliminate the decades of development time preceding launch or the civilizational coherence required throughout voyage duration. Antimatter drives and light sails promise shorter journeys, but require even longer development timelines and more sophisticated industrial coordination. Generation ships extend journey duration into centuries, while concentrating every factor that accelerates social transformation. Cryogenic suspension requires maintenance civilizations or civilization-equivalent automation. Artificial intelligence governance requires self-maintaining systems approaching civilizational complexity. The inescapable truth emerges, not from any single limitation but from the convergence of all limitations toward a common barrier. Human civilization cannot remain coherent across the timescales interstellar travel requires. This is not a technological failure to be solved through engineering advancement. This is not a resource constraint to be overcome through greater investment. This is not a political obstacle to be removed through better coordination. This is a fundamental characteristic of how human societies operate through time. The mathematical certainty of civilizational fragmentation operates through compound effects that guarantee transformation, regardless of initial conditions. The mechanisms are not mysterious. They are observable in every human society that has ever existed across every timescale longer than a few generations. Understanding these mechanisms reveals why civilization continuity collapse represents an absolute barrier rather than a practical difficulty. Small changes accumulate across generations through processes that appear negligible in isolation but compound relentlessly across time. Language shifts by fractions of percentages per year. As pronunciation drifts, vocabulary evolves, and grammatical structures simplify or elaborate. Cultural values drift through imperceptible degrees, as each generation interprets inherited beliefs through contemporary experience. Political alignments evolve through marginal adjustments, as power structures adapt to changing circumstances. Technical knowledge degrades through tiny transmission losses as expertise passes from masters to apprentices with inevitable fidelity failures. Each individual change appears manageable when observed over short timescales. The language spoken today differs only slightly from language spoken a decade ago. Native speakers communicate effortlessly across this gap. Cultural values have shifted measurably, but not radically across recent years. Continuity with recent past remains obvious. Political systems have evolved but maintain recognizable connection with their recent predecessors. Institutional memory spans these intervals without excessive strain. Technical knowledge continues transmitting to new generations through established educational systems that demonstrate adequate preservation of necessary skills. But compound effects operate exponentially across extended timescales. Small percentage changes per year become large transformations across decades. A language that drifts 1% per year differs by 10% after a decade, by 65% after a century, by over 99% after 5 centuries. The mathematics is inexorable. Manageable drift per generation becomes revolutionary change across centuries. Changes that individual generations absorb without noticing aggregate into complete civilizational metamorphosis across the timescales interstellar travel demands. Consider a hypothetical civilization that maintains 99% fidelity in transmitting its characteristics to succeeding generations. This represents remarkable stability, far exceeding anything historical civilizations have actually demonstrated. Parents would transmit almost everything they knew to children. Institutions would preserve almost all their foundational purposes. Technical knowledge would pass nearly intact from generation to generation. Cultural values would drift only minimally across each generational transition. Yet even at this exceptional rate of preservation, the mathematics of compound decay operates with devastating effect. After 100 generations, approximately 2,500 years at typical generational intervals, only 37% of original civilizational characteristics would survive. Nearly two-thirds would have transformed beyond recognition through accumulated small changes. After 200 generations, only 14% of original characteristics would remain. After 300 generations, less than 5% would persist. A generation ship travelling 85 years spans approximately 3 generations if crew members reproduce at typical human ages. This might seem like a short enough interval to preserve civilizational coherence, but the journey represents only one phase of the total mission timeline. Development time adds generations before departure. The propulsion systems, life support equipment, and vessel construction required for interstellar travel do not currently exist. Creating them would require decades of research, development, and industrial coordination. Mission planning and crew training would extend timelines further. Conservative estimates suggest at least 2 generations of development before any interstellar mission could launch. Colonial establishment adds generations after arrival. Passengers arriving at Proxima b would not immediately achieve civilizational stability. They would need to establish infrastructure, develop local resources, and build sustainable communities capable of long-term survival. This process would span additional generations as colonies transitioned from survival mode to established civilization. The full mission arc from conception through successful colonization could easily span 10 to 20 generations. At 99% generational transmission fidelity, a 10-generation mission would preserve only 90% of original civilizational characteristics. A 20-generation mission would preserve only 82%. The civilization that successfully colonized Proxima b would differ substantially from the civilization that conceived the mission, even under optimistic transmission assumptions. But no human civilization has ever achieved 99% transmission fidelity. The actual rate across historical examples falls dramatically lower. Languages transform radically within 10 generations. Old English from 1,000 years ago requires specialized study for modern English speakers to comprehend. The gap between Chaucer and contemporary speech spans merely 6 centuries. Latin evolved into mutually unintelligible Romance languages within comparable timescales, despite occupying a single political and religious framework designed explicitly to preserve linguistic unity. Cultures remake themselves within 5 generations. The values that seemed eternal to Victorian Britons appear quaint or offensive to their great-great-grandchildren. The certainties that defined American society in the 1920s had transformed beyond recognition by the 1970s. Each generation believes its values represent permanent truths, while history demonstrates their transience. Political systems rarely persist beyond 3 generations without significant reorganization. The Roman Republic transformed into the Roman Empire within a century. The French monarchy that seemed permanent in 1750 had been overthrown, restored, overthrown again, and replaced by multiple subsequent systems within a century. The Ottoman Empire, which dominated 3 continents for 6 centuries, transformed so thoroughly across its existence that early sultans would not recognize late Ottoman governance as their creation. Even constitutional systems that maintain formal continuity undergo substantive transformation that renders original structures unrecognizable to their founders. At realistic transformation rates observed across human history, the civilization that arrives at Proxima b would share only historical connection with the civilization that launched the mission. The language would differ sufficiently to impede communication with Earth. The values would have evolved through accumulated reinterpretation into frameworks the founders would not endorse. The political structures would have reorganized around shipboard circumstances that planners could not anticipate. The technical capabilities would have shifted as some skills degraded while others developed. The very purpose of the mission would have been reinterpreted through accumulated generational perspective changes until original objectives became incomprehensible or irrelevant. This is not a pessimistic projection about what might happen under unfavorable circumstances. This is not speculation about worst-case scenarios that better planning might avoid. This is an observation about what always happens to human civilizations across multi-generational timescales. The historical record contains no exceptions. Not one civilization in human history has maintained coherent purpose, structure, and capability across the timescales interstellar travel requires. Every civilization that persisted across centuries transformed beyond recognition. Ancient Egypt maintained apparent continuity for 3,000 years, but the Egypt of the Old Kingdom bore little resemblance to the Egypt of the Ptolemies except geographic location. China maintained dynastic succession for millennia, but each dynasty represented radical discontinuity with predecessors despite elaborate efforts to preserve continuity. The Catholic Church has persisted for 2,000 years while transforming in doctrine, practice, and organization so thoroughly that early Christians would not recognize contemporary Catholicism as their faith. Every empire that seemed eternal eventually dissolved or evolved into something its founders would not recognize. Rome fell in the west and transformed beyond recognition in the east. The Mongol Empire fragmented within decades of its greatest extent. The British Empire dissolved within a generation of its apparent peak. Each seemed permanent to contemporaries. Each proved transient to history. Every value system transmitted across generations eventually diverged from its origins through accumulated reinterpretation. Buddhism, in its various contemporary forms, differs dramatically from the original teachings while claiming continuity with them. Democracy means radically different things in different contexts than it meant to Athenian citizens who coined the term. Justice, freedom, honor, duty. Every value transmitted across centuries has transformed in meaning until original and contemporary versions share only vocabulary. The mechanisms driving this universal pattern operate independently of technology, geography, or political system. They emerge from the fundamental nature of how meaning transmits between human minds. Ideas cannot be transferred perfectly between individuals. When one person communicates a concept to another, the receiving mind does not create an identical copy of the sending mind's conception. Language requires interpretation that varies between individuals based on their different experiences, vocabularies, and cognitive frameworks. Concepts depend on context that differs between communicating parties. Values embed within experiential frameworks that are unique to each person who holds them. Every transmission of meaning involves some loss, some modification, some adaptation to the receiving mind's existing structure. The sender encodes meaning into language. The receiver decodes language into meaning. But encoding and decoding are not perfectly reversible processes. Information degrades, nuance disappears, context fails to transfer, implications shift. These transmission imperfections compound across generations with devastating cumulative effect. Parents cannot transmit exactly what they learned, because they modified that learning through their own experience before transmission. The parent who teaches a child about honesty teaches their own interpretation of honesty, developed through decades of adult experience, not the abstract concept of honesty they received as children. Teachers cannot convey exactly what they were taught, because their understanding evolved through years of application and refinement. Institutions cannot preserve exactly what their founders established, because every subsequent generation reinterprets foundational principles through contemporary lenses that the founders did not share and could not anticipate. This mechanism operates whether civilizations remain on planetary surfaces or journey through interstellar space. It operates whether populations number billions or thousands. It operates whether generations span decades or are compressed through circumstances into shorter intervals. The transmission of meaning across human minds inherently involves transformation. The transformation accumulates across each transmission. No engineering can prevent what emerges from the basic nature of human cognition. Interstellar travel would not create this limitation. Interstellar travel would expose this limitation by removing the moderating factors that slow transformation in terrestrial civilizations. On Earth, civilizational transformation confronts continuous feedback from external reference points. Other cultures provide alternative models that challenge local drift. When one society's values begin shifting in problematic directions, observation of different approaches can provide correction. Historical records preserve contrasting perspectives that subsequent generations can consult. When contemporary assumptions seem obviously true, historical documents can reveal that previous generations held opposite views with equal confidence. Geographic mobility exposes populations to diverse approaches, preventing any single framework from dominating without challenge. Trade networks transmit innovations across civilizational boundaries, providing continuous input that moderates isolated development. None of these moderating influences would exist aboard interstellar vessels or in isolated colonies around distant stars. A generation ship would possess no external cultures providing alternative models. Historical records would exist, but without living representatives of alternative frameworks, those records would become increasingly difficult to interpret accurately. No geographic mobility would expose travelers to different approaches, because no different approaches would exist within reachable distance. No trade networks would transmit external innovations, because no external civilization would exist within communication range. The transformation that requires centuries on Earth might require only decades in the enclosed environments of generation ships. The constraints that slow change in large connected populations would be absent from small isolated crews. The diversity that maintains balance would be replaced by homogeneity that enables rapid drift. The external feedback that corrects dangerous trajectories would be replaced by echo chambers that amplify them. This brings us back to the real limitation that makes interstellar travel impossible for human civilization. No matter how advanced the technology becomes, civilization continuity collapse remains the final barrier. The barrier is not technological, it is civilizational, and civilizational barriers do not yield to engineering solutions. Faster propulsion shortens journey times but cannot eliminate them. Even theoretical propulsion concepts operating at significant fractions of light speed require decades of travel time to reach Proxima b. Light itself requires over 4 years to cross the distance. No physical propulsion can exceed light speed, according to our current understanding of physics. Practical propulsion systems will always operate at small fractions of light speed, requiring transit times measured in decades at minimum. Decades of travel time require decades of civilizational coherence. The transformation processes that dissolve civilizational continuity operate continuously during transit. Faster propulsion reduces the time available for transformation, but does not stop transformation from occurring. No propulsion technology currently proposed or theoretically conceivable reduces journey times below the transformation timescales of human societies. Even a journey of 21 years at 20% of light speed spans nearly a full human generation. Children born at departure would reach adulthood before arrival. Those children would receive Earth as stories rather than experience. Their values would develop in shipboard contexts that mission planners could not fully anticipate. Their social structures would emerge from conditions that differ fundamentally from the societies that launched them. Smaller crews reduce the social complexity that accelerates transformation, but increase fragility in other dimensions. Small populations cannot maintain the diversity of skills required for sustained interstellar operations. Generation ships require expertise across countless technical domains: propulsion, life support, medicine, agriculture, manufacturing, education, governance. Small populations cannot sustain specialists in all required fields across multiple generations. Small populations face extinction risks that large populations can absorb. Diseases could spread through confined spaces without the population diversity. To ensure some members possess natural resistance, social conflicts could escalate without the moderating influence of larger communities. The redundancy that protects against individual failures disappears as population decreases. Small populations provide less genetic diversity to prevent inbreeding depression across multi-generational voyages. The minimum viable population for long-term genetic health has been estimated at various levels, but all estimates require populations measured in hundreds or thousands, not dozens. Smaller crews might complete shorter journeys but cannot sustain population health across the centuries that interstellar colonization requires. Larger populations improve redundancy against individual failures, but accelerate political fragmentation through mechanisms examined previously. More people means more competing interests that cannot all be satisfied simultaneously. More conflict means more energy devoted to internal disputes rather than mission objectives. The scale that provides stability against individual failures creates instability against social dynamics. Every parameter that mission designers might adjust optimizes for some concerns while worsening others. Smaller crews reduce social complexity, but increase fragility. Larger crews improve redundancy, but accelerate fragmentation. Faster propulsion shortens journey time, but requires longer development time. Slower propulsion reduces development requirements but extends transformation periods. There is no configuration that solves civilizational continuity, because civilizational continuity is not an engineering parameter. Civilizational continuity is an emergent property of human social organization that no design choice can guarantee. It emerges from countless interactions between individuals, institutions, and circumstances across extended timescales. It cannot be specified in mission requirements. It cannot be tested before launch. It cannot be maintained through technological intervention. The conclusion toward which all evidence converges stands now in sharp relief. Civilizational fragmentation over time is the fundamental reason no human will ever reach Proxima b. Not propulsion limitations, though those are real and impose minimum timescales that intersect destructively with civilization transformation rates. Not distance, though distance establishes the framework within which timescales become relevant. Not radiation hazards, though radiation presents genuine challenges that complicate mission design. not life support requirements, though sustaining human biology across decades or centuries demands engineering that does not currently exist, not energy supply, though powering interstellar missions requires capabilities beyond current human achievement. The fundamental barrier is human civilization's inability to maintain coherent purpose, capability, and structure across the timescales interstellar travel demands. Everything else is secondary. Solve every technical problem, develop every required propulsion system, design perfect life support, shield completely against radiation, supply unlimited energy. The civilizational barrier remains because the civilizational barrier is not a technical problem. This conclusion does not depend on pessimism about human nature. It does not assume that humans are uniquely flawed or limited compared to hypothetical alien species. It does not require believing that humanity will fail where success was otherwise possible. The conclusion depends only on observation of human history across every available example. Every civilization has transformed across multi-generational timescales. The transformation is not failure. The transformation is civilization, functioning as civilization has always functioned. Every institution has evolved beyond its founders' intentions across centuries. The evolution is not corruption. The evolution is institutions adapting to circumstances their founders could not anticipate. Every meaning system has drifted through accumulated reinterpretation across the years required for interstellar travel. The drift is not degradation. The drift is meaning systems remaining relevant to generations who hold them. The barrier is not that humans are flawed or limited in some correctable way. The barrier is that human civilizations operate through mechanisms that inherently produce transformation across time. These mechanisms are not bugs in human social organization. They are features that enabled humanity to spread across every continent, survive every climate, and develop technologies our ancestors could not imagine. Adaptability allows civilizations to respond to changing circumstances. But adaptability means transformation. A civilization that could not adapt would collapse when circumstances changed. A civilization that can adapt will adapt, transforming its structures to match new contexts. Flexibility allows civilizations to incorporate new knowledge and new approaches. But flexibility means drift. A civilization that could not integrate new understanding would stagnate and eventually fail. A civilization that can integrate new understanding will drift as that understanding reshapes existing frameworks. Responsiveness allows civilizations to adjust priorities based on current conditions, but responsiveness means deviation from original purposes. A civilization that could not shift priorities would pursue obsolete objectives, while vital needs went unaddressed. A civilization that can shift priorities will deviate from the purposes its founders established. The very characteristics that make human civilization successful on Earth make human civilization unsuitable for projects spanning centuries. The adaptability that enables survival in changing environments enables transformation that destroys mission continuity. The flexibility that permits incorporation of new knowledge permits drift that dissolves original purpose. The responsiveness that allows adjustment to current conditions allows deviation from objectives established generations earlier. A civilization incapable of changing would be a civilization incapable of surviving changing circumstances on Earth. Such a civilization would have been eliminated by the countless environmental, social, and technological transitions that human history has presented. The civilizations that survive to the present are precisely the civilizations that could transform in response to changing conditions. But a civilization capable of changing cannot guarantee that its changes will preserve the purposes that interstellar missions require. The capacity for transformation cannot be selectively applied only to circumstances where transformation is beneficial, while being prevented in circumstances where transformation is destructive. The mechanisms operate universally or not at all. This is not a failure of human civilization. This is the nature of human civilization. We are a species that adapts, evolves, transforms, and reinvents itself across time. These capabilities represent humanity's greatest strength across the timescales of terrestrial existence. They represent humanity's absolute limitation across the timescales of interstellar existence. The starship that departs Earth bound for Proxima b must be designed by humans who will not see its arrival. The designers will complete their work, retire, and die before the mission reaches even its midpoint. Their intentions will persist only as documentation, subject to all the interpretation drift that documentation experiences across generations. The starship must be built by civilizations that will not exist when it reaches destination. The industrial systems that manufacture components will have transformed. The political systems that allocate resources will have restructured. The economic systems that coordinate production will have evolved. The cultural systems that provide meaning and motivation will have drifted. By the time the vessel arrives at Proxima b, the civilization that built it will have become something else entirely. The starship must carry crews whose descendants will not share language, culture, or values with the planners who conceived their mission. Generation ships create isolated conditions that accelerate transformation. The people who arrive will be as alien to the people who departed as we are alien to our ancestors from centuries past. They will share ancestry. They will not share civilization. Every interstellar travel proposal assumes a solution to this problem. Technical specifications describe propulsion systems with impressive velocity capabilities. They describe life support systems capable of sustained operation. They describe radiation shielding sufficient for interstellar environments. They describe energy systems adequate for multi-decade journeys. None of them explain how human civilization will maintain coherent purpose across the centuries required for their implementation. None of them address the civilizational barrier that makes every technical solution irrelevant. None of them acknowledge that the barrier they ignore is the only barrier that ultimately matters. We stand at the end of our examination, facing the truth that waited at its beginning. Proxima b orbits the nearest star to our Sun. Astronomers have confirmed its existence through careful observation. It occupies the habitable zone where liquid water might exist on planetary surfaces. It may harbour conditions suitable for life. It represents everything that interstellar travel promises. A second world where humanity might establish itself, a cosmic backup against catastrophe that could destroy Earth, a home beyond our solar system where human civilization might continue if our original home becomes uninhabitable. The destination is real. The destination is stable. The destination will remain in the habitable zone of its star for billions of years. Time does not threaten Proxima b. The planet will orbit Proxima Centauri long after every human currently alive has died. Long after every civilization currently existing has transformed beyond recognition, long after the languages we speak have evolved into forms we would not understand, we will never reach it. Not because physics forbids the journey. The physics permits travel between stars. No fundamental law prevents matter from crossing the void between stellar systems. Light makes the journey. Gravitational influences extend across the distance. Physical connection between our solar system and Proxima Centauri exists, and could theoretically carry human travellers. Not because engineering cannot build the vessels. Engineers can design propulsion systems that physics permits. They can specify life support systems capable of sustained operation. They can create shielding adequate for interstellar radiation environments. The engineering challenges are immense but not impossible in principle, not because humans lack courage or vision or ambition. Humanity has demonstrated all three across every domain where demonstration was possible. We have explored every continent. We have visited the moon. We have sent robotic probes beyond our solar system. We have peered into the hearts of atoms and the depths of space. Courage, vision, and ambition are not what we lack. We will never reach Proxima b because the journey requires civilizational continuity that no human society has ever demonstrated. We will never reach it because no technology yet conceived can substitute for what civilizations provide. We will never reach it because the barrier is not technical but fundamental, rooted in how human meaning, purpose, and organization propagate through time. This truth changes how we must think about humanity's cosmic position. We are a species capable of detecting planets around other stars through the tiny wobbles they induce in stellar motion. We can calculate trajectories across light years with precision sufficient for navigation. We can design theoretical vessels for journeys requiring centuries of operation. We possess the intelligence to imagine interstellar travel in comprehensive detail. What we lack is the social coherence to execute what we imagine. Our civilizations transform too quickly. Our institutions evolve too readily. Our meanings drift too freely. We cannot bind our descendants to purposes they did not choose any more than we feel bound by purposes our ancestors chose for us. The dreams of interstellar travel that science fiction has cultivated for generations are not wrong about physics. The rockets could work. The life support systems could function. The journeys could be completed by vessels carrying human passengers. The dreams are wrong about civilization. They imagine technologies that physics permits while assuming social structures that history forbids. They solve engineering problems while ignoring the civilizational problems that make engineering solutions meaningless. Proxima b will continue orbiting its red dwarf star for billions of years after every human currently dreaming of reaching it has died. The planet will remain in the habitable zone, potentially offering conditions for life, potentially harboring environments where human civilization could theoretically flourish. The destination will wait with infinite patience because planets do not experience time as civilizations do. What will not remain stable is the civilization required to reach it. Human societies will continue transforming as they have always transformed. Empires will continue rising and falling as they have always risen and fallen. Languages will continue evolving as they have always evolved. Cultures will continue drifting as they have always drifted. Each transformation will add another layer of separation between any mission launched and the civilization that launched it. The barrier that separates humanity from the stars lies not in the void between suns but in the nature of human civilization itself. We are capable of great things measured in decades. The moon landings required only 11 years from commitment to completion. We are even capable of remarkable achievements measured in single centuries. The great cathedrals of Europe required generations of sustained effort, but we are not capable of maintaining the coherent purpose, stable institutions, and consistent capability that interstellar travel requires across multiple centuries. The timescales demanded exceed the timescales we have ever demonstrated. The continuity required exceeds the continuity we have ever achieved. The stability needed exceeds the stability that human civilization can provide. This limitation does not diminish human achievement. We have accomplished wonders within our civilizational timescales. The pyramids of Giza have inspired for 45 centuries. The works of Shakespeare speak across 400 years. The scientific revolution transformed human understanding within 3 centuries. We have achieved greatness within the intervals that our civilizations can sustain. What we cannot do is sustain the specific institutional, technological, and cultural coherence that would be required to bridge the gap between stars. The distance is not too great in physical terms. The time is too long in civilizational terms. And time operates differently on human civilizations than it operates on stellar distances. The stars will wait. They have waited for billions of years. They will wait billions more. Their patience is infinite because they do not experience time as we do. Proxima b has orbited its star since before life existed on Earth. But civilizations do not wait. Civilizations transform, fragment, dissolve, and reconstitute in patterns that no planning can prevent and no technology can override. The waiting time is too long. The transformation is too certain. The barrier is too fundamental. No human will ever reach Proxima b because the journey requires what humans cannot provide. Centuries of civilizational stability during transit would be required. Decades of civilizational stability during preparation would be required. The journey requires a civilization that does not transform into something else during the time required to complete it. No such civilization has ever existed in human history. No technology can create one, because technology requires civilization rather than replacing it. No engineering can substitute for one because the requirement is not engineering but social coherence that engineering cannot provide. The barrier is fundamental. It is rooted in how human meaning, purpose, and organization propagate through time. It emerges from the basic nature of how ideas transmit between minds, how values pass between generations, how institutions evolve across centuries. The barrier is not a problem to be solved. It is a characteristic of human existence to be understood. This is the real reason why no human will ever reach Proxima b. Not physics, which permits the journey. Not engineering, which could build the vessels. Not resources, which exist in sufficient quantity. Not will or courage or vision, which humanity possesses in abundance. The barrier is civilization itself, the brilliant, adaptable, ever-changing phenomenon that makes us human. The capacity for transformation that enabled us to spread across every continent and survive every challenge. The flexibility that allowed us to develop technologies our ancestors could not imagine. These very qualities make us incapable of the cosmic journeys we can so clearly imagine. The stars shine as they have always shined, indifferent to the civilizations that observe them. Proxima b orbits, as it has always orbited, unaware of the species that dreams of reaching it. The universe extends in every direction with possibilities beyond counting, patient and eternal, and utterly unconcerned with human limitations. And here we remain, a species that can see across light years while being bound by the timescales of our own civilizational coherence. A species that can imagine journeys requiring centuries while being unable to sustain the continuity those centuries demand. A species capable of understanding its own limitations with perfect clarity while being incapable of transcending them. This is our position in the cosmos. This is our limitation and our nature. This is the truth that waits behind every dream of interstellar travel, patient and unchangeable. The fundamental barrier that separates what we can imagine from what we can achieve. Human civilization will continue. It will transform and adapt and reinvent itself across centuries yet to come. It will produce wonders within its operational timescales. It will achieve greatness, measured in decades and even centuries. But it will not reach Proxima b. The journey is too long for civilizations that cannot help but change along the way. The transformation is too certain. The barrier is too fundamental. The stars will keep their distance not because the void between them is uncrossable, but because the time required to cross it exceeds the coherence time of the civilizations that might attempt the crossing. This is the inescapable truth. This is why no human will ever reach Proxima b.